Hey everyone, welcome back to Declassified History, and today I need to tell you about one of the most haunting, controversial, and ultimately redemptive stories to come out of World War II, a story about a single German soldier positioned in a concrete bunker overlooking Omaha Beach who, on June 6, 1944, fired an MG-42 machine gun and a rifle for 9 straight hours, expending somewhere between 12,000 and 13,500 rounds of ammunition, and according to his own testimony, may have killed or wounded anywhere from dozens to potentially hundreds of American soldiers during the most crucial invasion in military history. His name was Heinrich Severloh, and for decades after the war, he lived with a secret that tortured his soul, haunted his dreams, and made him question whether he was a soldier who followed orders or a mass killer who changed the course of history in those blood-soaked hours on the Normandy coast. This is not a story about glorifying war or celebrating death. This is about understanding the human beings caught in impossible situations, the weight of memory, the burden of survival, and ultimately, the power of forgiveness that would come decades later, when American veterans who fought on that beach would shake the hand of the man who tried to kill them. June 6, 1944, 6:30 in the morning, and 21-year-old Heinrich Severloh was positioned in Widerstandsnest 62, which translates to Resistance Nest 62. A fortified German position on the bluffs overlooking what the Americans codenamed Omaha Beach. And what Severloh could see from his position would have been both awe-inspiring and absolutely terrifying. The English Channel filled with more ships than anyone had ever seen in human history, thousands upon thousands of vessels stretching to the horizon, and heading straight toward him were landing craft packed with American soldiers from the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. Young men just like him, most of them probably scared out of their minds, many of them about to die. Severloh was not a Nazi ideologue, not a fanatic believer in Hitler's twisted vision. He was a farm boy from Lower Saxony who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht, assigned to the 352nd Infantry Division, and trained as a radio operator and gunner. But on this morning, his commanding officer, Lieutenant Bernhard Furking, had given him a simple, terrible order: defend this position, stop the invasion, and fire until you run out of ammunition or you're dead. The weapons at Severloh's disposal were devastatingly effective. An MG-42 machine gun, nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw because of its terrifying rate of fire at 1,200 rounds per minute, which was so fast that instead of hearing individual gunshots, you heard a sound like ripping fabric or a chainsaw, and this weapon was positioned with a perfect field of fire, covering the entire beach approach. Plus he had a carabiner 98K rifle with a scope, and a stockpile of approximately 12,000 rounds of ammunition for the MG-42, and another 1,000 rounds for his rifle. What happened next would be burned into Severloh's memory for the rest of his life, and into the collective memory of the American soldiers who survived what became known as Bloody Omaha, because as those landing craft dropped their ramps and American soldiers poured out into chest-deep water, Severloh began firing, and he didn't stop for 9 hours. Imagine being in Severloh's position for just a moment, not to justify what happened, but to understand the psychological reality. You're 21 years old. You know if you don't fight, you'll be shot for desertion. You can see thousands of enemy soldiers coming to kill you and everyone you know. Your officer is standing right behind you giving orders, and you've been trained for exactly this moment. So you do what soldiers have done throughout history. You follow orders, you fire your weapon, and you try not to think about the fact that every tracer round you see hit. Its target represents a human being with a mother, maybe a wife, maybe children, who will never go home. The MG-42 machine gun was one of the most lethal weapons ever created, and in Severloh's hands, with his elevated position, clear fields of fire, and massive ammunition supply, it became a killing instrument of horrific efficiency, with the gun firing 1,200 rounds per minute. That's 20 bullets every single second, creating an almost impenetrable wall of lead that swept across the beach like an invisible scythe, cutting down everything in its path. American soldiers who survived Omaha Beach later described the experience as hell on earth. Landing craft turning into floating coffins as machine gun fire ripped through them before soldiers could even get out, men being hit multiple times before they touched French soil, the water turning red with blood, bodies floating in the surf, and the psychological terror of knowing that somewhere up on those bluffs, German gunners could see everything and were methodically destroying wave after wave of attackers. Severloh later stated in interviews and in his memoir, Beast 62, a German soldier's memories of the defense of Omaha Beach that he fired approximately 12,000 rounds from the MG-42 and another 400 rounds from his rifle over the course of 9 hours, and while he could not possibly know the exact number of casualties he caused, he estimated based on what he saw through his sights that he may have hit hundreds of American soldiers, and this number has been disputed, debated, and analyzed by historians ever since. Here's where we need to pause and separate legend from verified history. Because the story of Heinrich Severloh has grown over the decades, with some accounts claiming he personally killed 2,000 or even 3,000 Americans, which would make him responsible for nearly all the American casualties at Omaha Beach. And this is almost certainly a massive exaggeration, because total American casualties at Omaha Beach for the entire day, from all German positions combined, were approximately 2,400 killed and wounded. So one man could not possibly have caused all of that. Historians who have studied the battle extensively, including Dr. Stephen Ambrose and researchers at the National D-Day Memorial, estimate that Severloh likely killed or wounded somewhere between 40 and 150 Americans, which is still a devastating and significant number, but far less than the mythical thousands that have been attributed to him. And the discrepancy exists because Severloh himself was traumatized, operating under extreme stress, and could not possibly accurately count casualties in the chaos of battle. Plus, over the years, the story grew in the retelling, as war stories often do. What is verified and not disputed is this. Severloh was positioned at WN 62, one of the most strategically important German positions overlooking Omaha Beach. He did fire an MG-42 machine gun for approximately 9 hours. He did expend an enormous amount of ammunition. His position did inflict heavy casualties on American forces, particularly those landing in the easy red sector of Omaha Beach. And his fire was one of several factors that nearly caused the Omaha Beach landing to fail completely. Around 3 p.m. on June 6th, after 9 hours of continuous combat, Severloh's position was finally being overrun. American forces had managed to fight their way up the bluffs despite devastating casualties. His ammunition was nearly exhausted. Lieutenant Firking had been wounded and ordered evacuation, and Severloh faced a choice: stay and die or retreat and survive. He chose survival, destroyed the MG-42 so Americans couldn't use it, and retreated inland with the remnants of his unit, beginning a long journey that would eventually lead to his capture by British forces, imprisonment as a POW, and finally release and return to Germany in 1946, where he went back to his family farm and tried to live a normal life. But the ghosts of Omaha Beach never left him. For decades, Heinrich Severloh told almost no one about what he had done on June 6, 1944. The memories haunted him. He had nightmares about the faces of American soldiers falling as his bullets hit them. He struggled with guilt, depression, and the terrible question that tormented him. Was I just following orders or was I a murderer? This internal struggle is something that thousands of combat veterans from all sides of all wars experience. What we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, the moral injury of having killed other human beings, even in the context of war, even when following orders, even when fighting for survival. The story could have ended there, a German veteran living quietly with his terrible secrets, but in the 1990s, something extraordinary happened that would change Severloh's life and offer him a path toward something resembling peace. American veterans began organizing return trips to Normandy for the 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994, and some of these veterans started researching the German positions that had opposed them, trying to understand the battle from the other side. And through this research, some of them identified WN 62 as one of the deadliest positions they had faced, and eventually they learned about Heinrich Severloh. In 2000, an American D-Day veteran named David Edward Schell, who had landed at Omaha Beach with the 29th Infantry Division and survived the hell that Severloh had contributed to, did something that most people would find incomprehensible. He tracked down Heinrich Severloh, traveled to Germany, knocked on the door of the now elderly farmer, and extended his hand in friendship. The meeting between Severloh and Schell is one of the most powerful examples of reconciliation and forgiveness in modern history. Here were two old men who had tried to kill each other 56 years earlier, who had been enemies in the most brutal battle of the most destructive war in human history, and instead of hatred they found understanding, empathy, and a shared recognition that they had both been young men following orders in circumstances beyond their control. Schell later said in interviews that meeting Severloh helped him understand that the Germans at Omaha Beach were not monsters. They were soldiers like him, scared, following orders, doing what they thought they had to do. And that forgiveness was not about excusing what happened, but about releasing the burden of hatred and recognizing shared humanity. For Severloh, meeting American veterans who did not condemn him but instead shook his hand and called him a fellow soldier was transformative. The guilt that had crushed him for decades began to lift, not because what happened at Omaha Beach became acceptable, but because he found that the men he had fought against could separate the 21-year-old soldier, following orders from the person he had become in the decades since. Severloh began attending D-Day anniversary commemorations in Normandy, meeting more American veterans, participating in documentaries and interviews, and finally telling his story publicly. And while his accounts were sometimes questioned and the numbers he cited were disputed, what emerged was a more complete picture of the Battle of Omaha Beach from the German perspective, something that had been largely absent from the historical record. In his memoir published in 2000, Severloh wrote with painful honesty about his experiences, the nightmares, the guilt, the faces he still remembered, and he emphasized repeatedly that he was not proud of what he had done, that he did not celebrate killing Americans, and that he hoped his story would serve as a testament to the absolute horror and waste of war, not as glorification of combat. Heinrich Severloh died on January 14, 2006 at the age of 79. Having made peace with at least some of the Americans he had fought against, having told his story so that history would remember not just the facts of the battle but the human cost on all sides, and having demonstrated that even the darkest chapters of human conflict can sometimes find resolution through forgiveness and reconciliation. The legacy of Heinrich Severloh and the Beast of Omaha Beach story is complicated and should make us uncomfortable, because it forces us to confront difficult questions. How do we remember soldiers who fought for evil regimes but were themselves not necessarily evil? How do we balance historical accuracy with the mythology that grows around war stories? How do we honor the American heroes who stormed Omaha Beach while also acknowledging the humanity of the Germans who defended it? And how do we process the fact that individual soldiers on all sides of war are often just young people following orders, caught in historical forces beyond their control, doing terrible things in terrible circumstances? The Battle of Omaha Beach succeeded despite devastating casualties. American soldiers displayed unbelievable courage in the face of withering fire from positions like WN-62. They fought their way up those bluffs meter by meter, secured the beachhead, and began the liberation of Europe that would end with Nazi Germany's total defeat 11 months later. And nothing about Heinrich Severloh's story diminishes the heroism of the Americans who fought there. What Severloh's story does is add a layer of complexity to our understanding of war, reminding us that behind every weapon, every position, every casualty statistic, there were human beings with families, fears, and futures, and that the true cost of war is measured not just in strategic victories or defeats, but in the psychological scars carried by survivors on all sides for the rest of their lives. If you found this story powerful and thought-provoking, please hit that like button and subscribe to Declassified History. For more deep-dive documentaries that explore the human stories behind the historical events, leave a comment below telling me what you think about Severloh's story, and whether forgiveness and reconciliation are possible even in the context of war. And let me know what World War II topic you want me to cover next. Because there are thousands of these human stories still waiting to be told. Stories that challenge our assumptions, complicate our understanding, and ultimately remind us why we study history in the first place. Not to celebrate war, but to understand humanity in all its complexity, courage, cruelty, and capacity for redemption.